Good afternoon, it's Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects. It is Monday, just barely into the afternoon, June the 8th of 2026, and I'm here in the shop just a few minutes before we open today. We generally are open on Mondays from 1 to 5 now, so hopefully there'll be a little bit of activity going on here in a bit. I wanted to dive back into some of the historical stitching that I've been interested in over the last few years and talk a bit today about a technique called net darning. You'll also see it listed in other places as filet lace, or even using the French term lacis, L-A-C-I-S, to refer to it. Now, the whole world of lace gets very complicated, and I don't want to try to go over all those different categories. Bobbin lace and crochet lace and tatting and probably a bunch of other styles of lace that I don't even know about. But this is a particular variant of that, and I'm not sure really if lace is the best word for it, but it gives it a kind of a look of lace that I want to talk about today. I got back interested in this idea because I was visiting one of the historic homes here in Leesburg, the Moat Morris House, which I'm going to be doing some tours of soon and hopefully doing some needlework tours. And I noticed some manufactured pieces there, particularly on the windows, that looked to me like some of the net darning that I had seen examples of in the past. So that's why I kind of dove back into this. So I'm going to talk about net darning, and I'm going to end up with just a little bit more information about Mary, Queen of Scots, who is for me one of the best examples of somebody who does net darning. So let me try to take a kind of a complicated discussion and break it down into pieces. First off, we know that nets go way, way back in human history. The desire to create an open kind of mesh creation that you could use to net fish or anything else that you might want to gather out of the water, or I guess even out of the air, required that humans create this this sort of mesh structure in order to have nets, and of course primarily for fishing. Now, nets are threads that are knotted at the corners. That's really the best way to describe that. So in their earliest forms, nets, people took strands of thread and they simply knotted the corners until they got a net big enough to be serviceable for what they were doing. As always, I think humans start out with a basic creation like that, but then very soon decide it needs to look nice. And so you begin to see decoration occur using nets, maybe not so much the utilitarian fishing nets that might have engendered the creation of nets to begin with, but certainly in terms of other objects and other things. So nets being knotted are outside of the boundaries of woven work and knitted work and things like that. It really is a separate kind of structure. So net darning takes the technique of nets and then creates designs over top of it. Now, at the end of today's video, I've given you some examples, and this may be one of those areas where you want to take a deeper dive and go look a little bit more into what's involved with these, and maybe it's kind of hard to describe. I don't have any really good examples here in the shop. I was surprised. I did have some net darning books and some net darning kits, but I think some intrepid shopper bought those a while back. What I do know about the history of this work is that it began to be decorative, particularly in churches, at least as early as the 12th and 13th centuries. There are examples of filet lace or net darn work in British cathedrals that go back into that period. You would take a net, which if you can kind of envision that as just a bunch of squares, or even nets could have been made with diamond shapes. There's various ways that nets could be configured. You take a long blunt needle with thread similar to the color of the net that you're using, and you fill in those areas with embroidery stitches to create designs. Again, it's going to be easier to envision this, I think, when you see the pictures at the end, but you may want to go and do some snooping around and look and kind of see what's involved. Now, I have not seen much net darning done in the modern era. I don't know of anybody who sits and does it, but it became very fascinating to me as a subject when I started diving deep into the history of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, I've referred to her before, and I'm going to show you a couple books that I think are really good sources if you missed those earlier videos. But the long and the short of Mary's history, and you probably know some of this yourself, she was born Queen of Scotland. She was sent off to France as a little girl to get her education. And there she would have learned all the most current and beautiful needlework styles. As a little girl, even though she was going to grow up to be a queen, she would have been taught to do all of the things that an educated and cultured young woman would know how to do. And fillet lace or net darning would have been one of those. And it turns out later on in Mary's life, net darning became one of her favorite pastimes. Now, you know, she went back to Scotland. There was a fairly fiery life there. Eventually, she had to flee to England, which was at that time ruled by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth was basically pretty scared of Mary being in England because Mary had some rights to the British throne, and Elizabeth, of course, wanted to hold on to her position as the Queen of England. So basically, Mary became a prisoner of Queen Elizabeth I and was housed in various places around England, but was very strictly imprisoned and didn't have much opportunity to do anything. Not only the things that a queen would do, but the things that any normal human being would do. So she found herself in very straight circumstances, and that's when she got into various kinds of needlework. And it's really quite fascinating to go in and look at all the various things that Mary created during those, I think it was 19 years that she was in prison in England. If you're interested in a book on this topic, I've given you a picture of this at the end, but The Needlework of Mary, Queen of Scots by Margaret Swain is a wonderful resource. Now, this book's not in print. I managed to find one on the internet and have a copy of it, but it's a great resource because not only net darning, but so many other techniques and ideas that Mary both designed and stitched are cataloged and looked at in that book. The other thing we know about Mary as she was in prison is that she used her embroidering and her stitching to exert her own ideas and her own power. And a book that I love that gets into that subject a little more is called Embroidering Her Truth, Mary, Queen of Scots in the Language of Power by one of my favorite authors, Claire Hunter. And you've heard me refer to Claire's books before, and I've even mentioned this book before back when I was reading it. So net darning was one of the things that Mary, Queen of Scots used to pass the time, to practice her embroidery, but also to create designs that expressed her individuality, her power and prestige as a queen. And, you know, even in its own little way, you could think of some of the needlework that she created to that time as being fairly dangerous to her enemies, because she would have created motifs, she would have created images that called to mind her own royal background as the Queen of Scotland, and even perhaps as the Queen of England. Symbols were very important then, as they still are today. And when Mary stitched those things into her designs, she was sometimes exerting her own opinions and power as a queen and as perhaps one who might at some point want to be the Queen of England. Now, what really finally ended up being Mary, Queen of Scots' demise was that she began to plot in the small ways that she could in her imprisonment to not only escape and maybe go back to Scotland, but also to take over the throne of England, which some argued she had some right to have. So, you know, it's a fascinating history, and it's fascinating to look at actual pieces that are still owned by museums and private homes in England that were created by Mary, Queen of Scots. But to get back to net darning, what I have noticed as I've spent so many of the last few years visiting historic homes and things like that is that those ideas of net darning or filet lace, when the Industrial Revolution came along and people began to buy products that were already made, were heavily influenced by that. If you think about those lace curtains that you've seen on windows, maybe in your own history, but also maybe when you visited historic homes or in certain parts of the world, they're made in various ways. They're not all net darned products. But I think some of the earliest inspiration for that goes back to the net darning techniques, because it went directly from those early netted fibers to creating images. So you're going to want to study the pictures at the end of this video just to get a little bit of a sense of that. As I mentioned, I've recently kind of signed on as a docent at the Moat Morris House here in Leesburg, which is a wonderful old building. They used to actually sit right across the street from where I am now, and it was such a valuable resource that it was moved 2 blocks over and placed in a new location here in Leesburg. And what I'm putting together, what I've begun to study, is the various kinds of needlework that were donated to the house and that would have been resident in the house in the 1890s and afterwards as various people lived there. We know that those pieces were valuable at that time and that they continue to be so today. And you know, that's kind of the whole point of my whole YouTube, my whole video series, is this idea that these wonderful creations that were made by hands in the past have continued on and continue to influence us. Even if they have found machines now that will do the kind of lace that had to be done by hand in former days, it's still influenced, and the motifs and the ideas are largely based on that early history. So check out net darning, or as I mentioned, filet lace, another way to talk about it, or lacis, L-A-C-I-S, the French term for it. Maybe dig around a little bit, and if you see some images in the photos at the end of the video, you might find that you have some things like that in your own stash somewhere that might be useful. And if you want to dig into it even more fully, you'll have to be able to make a distinction between crochet lace and bobbin lace and tatted lace and those kind of things. But I think it's just fun to kind of explore all of those various techniques and images and see what we can come up with. So that's it for today. A little talk about net darning and a little talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, and a dive back into the history of net darning. As always, this is Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects.